Do you think everyone should have imposter syndrome at some point? Or do you think it's healthier to never have imposter syndrome?
I think imposter syndrome is healthy in moderation
Okay, I agree with you. I'm glad we set that baseline, yes.
because I've learned like after my PhD when I was working with some other PhD students as a postdoc that when you don't have that imposter syndrome and you think that you know it all and you're doing well, this is where you start to make mistakes because you think you just know everything, but reality is chances are that you don't know everything. And I found that during my PhD, me questioning everything might have slowed down me a little bit at times, but it got me to where I needed to be. And I think it made me into a better scientist because I knew that I don't know everything and I asked a lot of questions. And that developed my critical thinking and me thinking like a scientist.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Reforming Academia. We're your hosts. I'm Chloe.
And I'm Vicky.
And today's topic, we're going to hit a hot topic. I feel like this is one you talk about all the time during grad school, but imposter syndrome. Bum, bum, bum. I should really add those sound effects back in on the side because otherwise I end up doing my own. All right. Vicky, where do we even begin with this?
I think I've gotten better with accepting myself as a scientist post PhD, but I think I've really struggled with imposter syndrome, especially early on in my PhD.
I've got a question for you because maybe this is a good way to start out. I've heard there's two camps on this. Do you think everyone should have imposter syndrome at some point? Or do you think it's healthier to never have imposter syndrome?
I think imposter syndrome is healthy in moderation.
Okay, I
Uh,
agree with you. I'm glad we set that baseline, yes.
because I've learned like after my PhD when I was working with some other PhD students as a postdoc that when you don't have that imposter syndrome and you think that you know it all and you're doing well, this is where you start to make mistakes because you think you just know everything, but reality is chances are that you don't know everything. And I found that during my PhD, me questioning everything might have slowed down me a little bit at times, but it got me to where I needed to be. And I think it made me into a better scientist because I knew that I don't know everything and I asked a lot of questions. And that developed my critical thinking and me thinking like a scientist. I think I've gotten better with realizing, you will not know everything. That's just the truth. Science is so vast and that I won't have answers to everything. But I've gotten to accept that I am a good scientist. I know things, but it took so long, I feel like at times. I think early in my PhD, I really struggled with the fact that I felt like everyone knew everything and I just didn't know anything. That's kind of the feeling. And I think my PI had to like reassure me a couple of times where it was like everyone has their own timeline. You don't have to know everything. Um, I think for me how I felt with my imposter syndrome. I don't know how you felt, Chloe. I don't know if you want to share how your PhD went.
Yeah. Well, my PhD was a bit of a hot mess,
Yeah.
especially at the end. But imposter syndrome wise, I agree exactly. Like, I think in moderation, like I'm not saying stress yourself out all the time unnecessarily, but I do think the worst scientists are the ones who think that they know everything and can do everything perfectly. Because that's exactly what you said. That's when the mistakes happen. That's when the overconfidence can turn into like fudging data and like, yeah, slippery slope. But very similar to you, especially my first few years, I just straight up didn't feel like I belonged. Um, Definitely, I do think some of that has to do with being a woman in academia. Go see our previous episode on that. Um, but I do also think it's a really good place to start when you're starting your PhD because what you said, you learn the critical thinking, the okay, I don't know anything, but I am here to learn. I think that's the most important part, to be frank, of being a scientist is the always being willing to learn and discover new things. And once you start thinking that you're the smartest person there and you know everything, that's when things start to fall apart. And to be frank, that's even like I feel like a lot of more senior scientists fall into this trap too, because if you've been studying the same pathway, the same protein for years and years and years, you think you know everything. And if someone else comes in, a new discipline, new field, bringing some thoughts in and say, oh, what if it doesn't actually work like that, right? What if there's so many times in scientific history where these things have happened, where people are like, oh, it couldn't have been like this at all. And the mainstream fields rejecting these out there positions that then become mainstream science once they've proven it and fought for it for years and years. Um, yeah, so I definitely struggled with it too much. To be frank, I always say this: the time when I realized I didn't have imposter syndrome in science anymore was actually my PhD defense, which is way too late. But it was the moment because I was getting questions and grilled by my committee, and they were like trying to scare me. Like they're asking the tough questions, and I'm realizing I know more about what I'm talking about that all of you guys put together, and even these hardball questions you're throwing at me, like I can answer them. And when you realize that, like the so-called or self-appointed experts, and really, that I feel there's very few times in your life where this happens, and a PhD defense is one of those times, where I was like, wow, okay, you know what? I do deserve this. I do know my stuff, and blah blah blah. Hopefully, did you figure it out sooner than your PhD defense?
I just wanted to also say I think that I finally figured out at my PhD defense, like right when I was prepping for my PhD defense, and my professor was asking me like, "Hey, do you want to practice?" I'm like, "No, I'm okay. I'll be fine. Like, I am not stressed about this. This is okay. Like, I know what I'm talking about at this point." But I think, yeah, it pretty much did take me the whole PhD to get there. I think in the last year, actually, I think more in the last year, I felt confident in myself and what I was doing. I think I finally figured it out at that point, like how I work, not just besides imposter syndrome comes in a lot of different waves. And I think for me in the last year, it was more of like I had the structure down of how my day to day went. I think I understood was well read. Like I wrote a lot of papers at that point related to my topic. I knew my experiments well. I knew why things were working and were not. So I felt very confident in myself at that point. But it did take me until almost the year of my PhD to get that way. But also to add on, as I left my PhD and I went into the postdoc, and having like if you don't have that imposter syndrome to some degree, there were the people where I came in and someone was like, no, this is how it's going to work. And I'm like, science is ever changing. You having a no imposter syndrome and thinking that you're know it all causes your science to suffer because you're not open to new ideas. You're not questioning, like, maybe I should try this out. Maybe they are right, because science is ever changing and you need to have that degree of like, yeah, I might not know everything because science is always changing. At least that's what I think.
No, I agree 100%. So did feel imposter syndrome then when you started your postdoc?
A bit, yeah, especially because you're going into a new field. At least for me, I was going into a new field, so I definitely felt like, oh, I don't know a lot of stuff, but I was very confident, I would say, when it came to like technique wise, because I spent so much time doing. I came in because of my techniques, and I felt like confident to how I was doing things. I was always open to learning, and I think that's what my imposter syndrome taught me, was being open to learn. But I entered, I felt like, in an environment where some people were just not open to new things. And I think it's due to the lack of the imposter syndrome, when you think that you know everything and that no one can tell you otherwise. I also can go into like Nepo babies and science, but that's what it stems into.
I feel like those are the classics. A lot of nepo babies, and for context, for people who aren't familiar, because nepo baby normally think of as like the celebrities. Nepo baby in the academic world means that they have parents or family that are ingrained in academia, so they've kind of gotten a leg up in everything they do because they've always had research experience and people in their corners. Yeah, and usually they are the worst ones to work with.
That's so true.
And so I guess what you talked about, that's like the healthy version of what you come out with imposter syndrome, is like skepticism, willing to learn, and always being willing to learn and appreciate new ideas. I'd say at my start of my PhD, I was a bit more on the toxic, unhealthy side of imposter syndrome. Definitely balanced with like the appreciation for learning, do other things. But I think the first year, I kind of like bent over backwards when I knew how to do certain techniques, similar to what you were saying, where it's like, this is the way it's been done. And of course, I think when you join a new lab, you should learn the way it's been done. So then you can see, how that compares to what you've done before and if there's ways to improve on it. And that's exactly what happened. Is that your cat?
Yeah, she's being a little rowdy today. Misty, what's up today, huh?
A little bit of a sass.
Yeah.
So you obviously need to learn what the new lab is doing so you can compare it to your old stuff. But I think early on when I was in the lab, actually, not even techniques, I'd say more of like how things were organized in the lab. I came in, it was a complete hot mess. And I just sat back, I was like, okay, I guess this is just how they do it, like how their bottles are organized and everyone has their different reagents and blah, blah, blah. And then after when the older wave of people left and I became one of the more senior people, I was like, screw this. Because we'd had so many times where experiments, like we were doing the same experiment, me and say another PhD student, but we had our own reagents. They're meant to be the same reagents, but they're our own bottles, right? And that was just enough for the experiment to work differently. Even heck, stocks of various dyes we had. And I was like, this is enough of this. Like, this is crazy. If we're having to repeat experiments over and over just because we're using different reagents, just solidify, simplify. And so I spend a time, and this kind of leads into me becoming lab manager, unfortunately, but organizing things and making sure that everyone was using the same protocols for making reagents and pHing the same way, et cetera, et cetera. And it sounds like a no-brainer, but like to people outside of academia, like, oh, of course you'd want to use the same things. But I feel like when people get stuck in their ways, exactly when the imposter syndrome fails people, or they stop listening to that little voice in the back of their head, it really hurts them. So maybe we can now talk about ways to mitigate or handle imposter syndrome. I guess a big one for me to start with is just being open that you don't know everything, because you really need to know that in academia, and just being willing to sit down and do your homework and learn. Something that helped me a lot was when I joined the lab I was in, I had a whole binder printed out of all the lab's old papers, and I went through that with a highlighter, a pen, sticky notes, and I just read everything back and front till I knew. Like if someone talked about a specific discovery that had happened in the lab, I could tell you what paper that was from, what figure.
I spent a lot of time early in my PhD reading a lot of papers, and I think that that helped me a lot because then I became aware of all the literature that's already out there. Also, just learn like being open and just learning as much as you can, tying it back into my postdoc. And by the way, I was in a great lab during my postdoc. I liked where I was at. The PI was great. Majority of the lab was fantastic. Like the people I was working with. But no matter in whatever place you're going to end up, there's always going to be maybe one or two people that could use some improvement. Not necessarily that they're bad people, but
It's like my wet lettuce guy. I left
yes,
him in, by the way, in the last podcast.
there are. I feel like there's people that might need some improvement, and I think everyone in general in life could benefit from learning a thing or two. But I think it's just being open to learning. Like you said, I went into my postdoc and there were techniques that I was already doing, but I wanted to see how they were doing it. And at some point, and I came and I started asking questions, like being open to questions. I think that's the thing. Also, when it comes to imposter syndrome, I ask questions. I was like, "Why are you doing this way?" Like there is a reason why things are done in the lab a certain way. So I
That's a
asked
big
them, like,
thing, I think, asking questions. Because when you
yes.
start early on your PhD, one, it's expected. You don't know everything. And I think there's definitely some stigma. Like, I remember when I started asking a lot of questions, and there's one person who was like, shouldn't you know this already? And I was even like, regardless of if I do know it or not, I want to know how you, the person who's teaching
Mhm.
me, thinks of this thing. Because that can inform so much more about everything else that you're teaching me.
Yeah, so I came in and I asked questions because I know these techniques and I do them a certain way because of X, Y, and Z. So I came in and I asked questions. Why do you do it this way? And my biggest pet peeve, because we've always done it this way.
Eh. I really need to get these sound effects up. I want the big buzzer.
And it's not the right way to do things. It's not because so I came up and I was like, hey, and it was just for reference, it was Western blotting, and I was like, I'm very good at Western blotting. So I came in and I was like, hey, if you can change a few things, like you don't need to do this and this and this, like we can simplify this, like you will get a much better result. She's like, no, it's not going to work. And I was like, okay, the only way to know if it's going to work is to try it. I will show you it's going to work. So redid the whole protocol, ran it with their reagents, beautiful blot. And I was like, this is when you get stuck in your ways and you think that you know it all. It's going to backfire. So having some imposter syndrome is good, and because it will drive you to ask questions. You should always be asking questions in the lab, no matter, it doesn't make you seem stupid. It's actually because it shows that you are curious and that you want to learn, because that's the whole point of your PhD, is learning. And in general, in science, it's all about learning something new every day. Reading a lot. There should be reading a ton of papers. Science is always changing, so there's new information coming out. And willing to listen, I think, not just even ask questions, but willing to listen to why people do things the way that they do.
100%. I feel like I agree everything you just said. Yes, yes, yes. For middle, like later stage PhD, I feel like how I was trying to mitigate imposter syndrome, because I think early on it's good to have, let's say, a healthy amount to so you don't feel like you know everything. But middle, later stages, like I still had it, but there were ways, I guess, when I was like, okay, Chloe, you actually do know your stuff. Say when I was going the first time to present an academic conference, for example, or when I was doing my qualifying exam. Um, I had one thing, and I highly recommend people do this. I've seen some talk about it online, but not enough. Is, when you do like your lab reports and stuff, or what do you call it, lab meetings, and you have your PowerPoints, you're showing your data, have that almost be like a record of everything you've done every time you're presenting. I went even one step further, and I had a list. Actually, I had two Word docs, and every day I'd have like my list or plan for the week in one, and then the other side I'd be like almost a diary, similar to a lab notebook, but it'd be way more structured, like a these are the experiments I'm doing today. These are the exact results, like much more condensed, I suppose, than a lab notebook, which is going to have all the methods as well and everything else listed out. Um, and then I'd also like highlight, say, if I was learning a new technique there. And that was a really great thing, especially leading up to my qualifying exam. I was able to go back very quickly and see just like an accomplishment check of like, okay, I've actually done all this stuff. I'd also write in there too, like what papers I'd read during those days. And that's where my notes for some of the papers would be. So I think a lot more of like the record keeping, just to hold yourself. What is it? It's not accountable. It's the other way, to show yourself that you've actually done the work. Because sometimes you do need that, like the sanity check that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know. Did you do something like that?
Not so much during my PhD. I had a very elaborate uh, lab notebook, which I think my PI really liked. But um, I think I did that a lot during postdoc, where I used Benchlink, and then I just kind of wrote out every day what I did, and like not just like anything I did, experiments, any modifications, any results. I think it helped me a lot with structure and blending into the lab. I think it just helped me to record keep better, and just adjust to my new imposter syndrome in general a bit better.
That could be a really good application of AI. This is a huge tangent here, but like when we were talking about just all the different ways that AI can make sure improve records and all that, a really big one could be in lab. Like if you've got something like, I don't know, maybe you need to like have a recorder or something with you that you just like speak what you're doing as you're doing it, then it pops it all in as a whole protocol. You're able to speak in the results. You just take a picture and it'll do like just record keep it all for you. I don't know, that could be cool. Was that what Benchlink was like?
Benchling, no, it was primarily typing, but I know that they're implementing a lot of things, and I haven't used Benchling in like over a year, so it could be. But I know, like for example, also it is a very common thing to do, but this like what me and you did with typing up what we did each day. My husband does that, and he has a huge like Word file of like every day with talking about like what he did if experiment failed. He wrote out even like modifications in his protocol. He's super detailed, and sometimes when he's learning new techniques, he's recording them, and then he has like those recordings in there so he can always reference back and go and rewatch them. And I think he has probably some imposter syndrome, but I think he is much better at handling it just because he also is a very good like record keeper.
Yeah, I feel that is it's a big it's a problem in academic culture when because in biotech and pharma I feel like there's so much more stringent about writing things down. In academia, partly because we're so like you can do a lot more of your own stuff, whatever you want. But the record keeping is so important where like, 5 years later you're trying to figure out what you did and why you did it for a paper that you're submitting. I'm more like your husband in terms of I was very over the top with my record keeping. Also, in addition to like the PowerPoints that I prepare and stuff like that, every time I did an experiment, I would make it actually ended the final thing was like an Adobe thing, but I would take all the I did all this microscope stuff, so I'd take all the like good photos from the microscope and then put them into like honestly a figure that was ready to show. And even if it failed, like I'd still have like the date there, the rough methods and what was there, and then the results. And that was honestly the best thing for me to reference. One, it was easy to pop into those PowerPoints later, but two, if I could be like, okay, so why I don't know, why did I drop doing this technique when 3 years later Sarah's writing up my thesis? And it's like, oh, because I tried it 3 times and I look at these short images and they're all black. All right, now to the spill the tea corner. We've got our one here from today. So I studied at the best public university in my country and in one of the best facilities of biology. It was really difficult to adjust because I burned out while in undergrad with everything I was studying. I didn't have free time. At most, I had a free afternoon on Saturdays, and it was hard seeing that the only way to succeed was to care about my career above health, family, and friends. And once I graduated, it was even harder to see if I wanted to continue in science, that I was going to have to continue working a bunch without any pay in order to get more experience. So I went into industry instead, and I do get comments about wasted potential. However, having a stable paycheck and fixed working hours helped with the burnout immensely. I'm now back in a master's program while I'm working, and I do feel again like the science academic pressure to put academia first in order to succeed is really tough. But I also no longer believe that we need to keep putting our careers above our health, family, and friends.
I totally agree that your health and family and everything else should not come at the cost. And I think that there is like a bit of a culture when we talk about academia that they're this burnout culture where you're constantly having to work 24/7. Academia is changing and it doesn't have to be this way also. Like I think that my PI was very open about having like normal schedules. He also very much a believer where that you should not be overworking, you should be taking time off and giving your brain time to rest. You will work much better, much more efficient if you're well rested. And I totally agree with that. um, but it does make it because you're not working 24/7. I think at some point, because we go into PhDs thinking like, oh, we need to be working so much, so much. And this creates like a bit of an also imposter syndrome because they're like, well, if I take a step back, like, do I not fit in here anymore?
I think it ties into exactly what you said, the broader thing about imposter syndrome, where if you aren't giving up everything else in your life for the sake of science, that you somehow aren't a great scientist. And I agree that it is changing that the younger generation of faculty that are getting in there recognize that we need I think it's more than just putting science first is a bad take. It's more that when you force people to sacrifice their health, their family, their friends, they're ultimately not going to be as good of researchers because they're going to burn out more regularly. They're going to be tired all the time. And ultimately, science is so you need a bunch of creativity. And creativity only comes when you feel like you're in the right headset, like you're relaxed, you're happy, you're where you're supposed to be. And you're not going to be in a creative headset, or headset, my gosh, mindset. Wow. You're not going to be in a creative mindset if you're burnt out, you're not sleeping enough, you've got no family and friends. Heck, that was why I got a cat during grad school, was to partly it was, how do I say it? I love my cats. I feel like I just make excuses for why I got them all the time. They are so much of me, but they got me through grad school as well. They reminded me that the world is so much bigger than my PhD.
If you ever look into some of the Nobel Prize winners, if you look, they all have hobbies that they did outside, and they all usually would take a step back outside of research or doing whatever they were doing and had hobbies and things that they did outside. They had real lives because they took away some time from science to enjoy their life and live their life and come in with this open space in your mind, in your head, for science, because it's exhausting constantly reading papers, doing experiments. It will lead to burnout, but that's not the way for you to actually become a better scientist and more creative.
Research discoveries also aren't linear. If you hear from like some of the most experts, the ones that win like Nobel prizes and stuff, and you ask where their eureka moment came from, it is I've never heard them say while I was slaving away in a lab for 18 hours a day. It's always been like, oh, when I was on this hike, or when I was chatting with a friend over dinner. They've all got these like odd little stories of how inspiration came to them. And sometimes it's completely out of left field, like the walking my dog or something. But even like just talking with other researchers in other departments and getting ideas from other people that way. And like you say, I think we're starting to recognize that there's more to science than just giving 24 hours a day in a lab. But we've still got ways to go. And for sure, the person who wrote in for this, they're in a less than ideal situation, unfortunately. But better places do exist. And as long as, especially you learned it early on, I'd say in undergrad, that science research can try to take everything from you. And I think the earlier you recognize that and start putting safeguards and rails about your personal life versus your research life, I think the happier you'll be in the long term. So I think good they're figuring it out now.
I agree. I mean,
Yeah.
at some point you will realize that science is not your whole life.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that was maybe this is a topic for another day, because another one we want to talk about is just like figuring out life after PhD, because you tie your identity so much to your PhD during grad school, and you're like, what the heck do you do with yourself when you're out? And the imposter syndrome definitely plays into all of that, because you've been feeling like an imposter for so long that you don't feel like you're a scientist, you're not a PhD level. Then when you get that PhD, you're like, oh, what's next? On these bombshells, thanks so much for tuning in. We're Reforming Academia with your hosts, Chloe and Vicky. See you next time.
Bye bye, guys.
Science is for everyone.